In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless species have risen and fallen, where empires span star systems and technology can reshape reality itself, there exists one question that no advanced civilization has ever been able to answer satisfactorily. It's not about faster-than-light travel, or the nature of consciousness, or even the meaning of existence itself. It's a question that comes from the innocent curiosity of a child, delivered with the brutal honesty that only youth can possess. A question that can make the most hardened space marine shift uncomfortably in their armor, cause diplomatic ambassadors to stumble over carefully prepared speeches, and leave xenobiologists questioning everything they thought they knew about interspecies relations. If you're single, would you marry her? When that question echoes through the corridors of a human research vessel, spoken by an alien child whose species has never known the concept of love as humans understand it, it sets in motion a chain of events that will challenge everything the galaxy thinks it knows about humanity. Because while other species have conquered worlds, built magnificent cities among the stars, and unlocked the secrets of the universe, they've never encountered anything quite like the human heart. And, sometimes, the most profound revolutions begin not with the clash of armies or the roar of starship engines, but with the simple, devastating honesty of a child who doesn't yet know that some questions aren't supposed to be asked. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen her share of impossible things during her 15 years as a xenobiologist aboard deep space research vessels. She'd watched gas clouds form sentient thoughts, witnessed crystalline beings that sang entire symphonies with their molecular vibrations, and once spent 3 months studying a species that communicated entirely through controlled electromagnetic pulses. But nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the sight of the small, blue-scaled figure sitting cross-legged on the medical bay floor, methodically dismantling one of their most sophisticated diagnostic devices with what appeared to be a hairpin. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old by human standards, though Dr. Chen knew better than to make assumptions about alien aging processes. The Zephyrian species typically stood nearly 7 feet tall at maturity, with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift between reptilian and something almost ethereal. This particular individual, however, barely reached Sarah's waist and possessed the unmistakable aura of concentrated mischief that seemed to transcend species barriers. Kira, Dr. Chen said, using the name the child had provided when the rescue team found her drifting in a damaged escape pod 3 days ago. What exactly are you doing to my equipment? The child looked up with large, golden eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality typical of her species, but with an underlying tone that suggested she found most adult concerns amusing. Your medical scanner was making inefficient calculations. I'm improving the quantum resonance matrix. Dr. Chen blinked. She'd spent 6 years in advanced xenotechnology studies and barely understood half of what the child had just said. Right. Well, perhaps you could improve it without taking it apart? Improvement requires deconstruction of flawed systems, Kira replied matter-of-factly, then held up a component that Sarah was fairly certain hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. Your people build with such linear thinking. Very limiting. Before Sarah could respond, the medical bay doors slid open and Commander Jake Morrison stepped inside. At 6'2" with the kind of rugged features that belonged on recruitment posters, Jake had the distinction of being both the youngest ship commander in the fleet and, according to ship gossip, perpetually single despite numerous attempts by colleagues to set him up with suitable partners. Dr. Chen, I need an update on our guest, he began and then stopped short when he noticed the small alien child holding what appeared to be the guts of a 1,000,000-credit medical device. Is she supposed to be doing that? Apparently she's improving our technology, Sarah said, shooting an exasperated look at Kira. I'm beginning to think we rescued a very small engineer instead of a refugee. Kira set down the device components and turned her attention to Commander Morrison with the focused intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. She tilted her head, studying him from multiple angles in a way that made Jake visibly uncomfortable. You're the pack leader, she announced after a moment. Your pheromone signature indicates dominance and protective instincts. Also, you're unmated. Jake's eyebrows shot up. I'm sorry, what? Zephyrians have enhanced chemical sensing capabilities, Sarah explained quickly, shooting a warning glance at Kira. She can probably detect all sorts of biological markers we're not even aware of. Your stress hormones spike when you look at Dr. Chen, Kira continued with the cheerful obliviousness of youth. But not in a fear response. More like anticipatory excitement. Interesting. The temperature in the medical bay seemed to rise several degrees. Sarah felt her cheeks warming as Jake cleared his throat loudly and focused intently on his datapad. Right, he said, his voice slightly strained. Well, I actually came to discuss Kara's situation. We've been analyzing the debris from her escape pod, and it appears her ship was attacked by hegemony forces. Sarah's attention snapped back to the serious matter at hand. The hegemony was a loose alliance of militaristic species that had been expanding aggressively through this sector of space. They had a particular hatred for what they considered weak species, those that prioritized science, art, or philosophy over military might. The Zephyrian colony ship was carrying over 10,000 civilians, Jake continued. Long-range sensors show debris scattered across half a solar system. There's no indication of other survivors. Kira's golden eyes dimmed, but she didn't display the emotional response Sarah might have expected from a human child who'd just learned she'd lost her entire family and community. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully, as if processing complex data. The hegemony considers my people weak because we solve problems through innovation rather than violence, Kira said. They see our focus on science and harmony as a threat to their expansion philosophy. I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah said gently, kneeling down to bring herself closer to the child's eye level. We'll do everything we can to help you. Kira studied her for a long moment, then turned to Jake. Your species is known to the hegemony, but they haven't attacked human colonies. Why is this? Jake exchanged glances with Sarah. It was a fair question, and one that highlighted an uncomfortable truth about humanity's position in galactic politics. Humans have a reputation for being difficult to subjugate. We have a tendency to fight back in unexpected ways. Your people are warriors, then? Not exactly, Sarah said. We're complicated. Kira seemed to consider this, then returned to her work on the medical device. Her small hands moved with surprising precision as she began reassembling components in a configuration that definitely hadn't been in the original design specifications. The hegemony attacked our ship because they believed we posed no threat, Kira said without looking up. They were partially correct. Zephyrians are not a warlike people. But they made an error in their assessment. What kind of error? Jake asked. Kira held up the reassembled medical scanner, which now hummed with an energy signature that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. They assumed that intelligence and the capacity for violence are mutually exclusive. They failed to account for what happens when intelligent people become motivated to fight back. She handed the device to Sarah, who stared at it in amazement. According to the display, it was now capable of scanning at the quantum level and could apparently detect biological anomalies that shouldn't be visible to any known technology. How did you, Sarah began? I observed, I learned, I improved, Kira said simply. It's what intelligent beings do when faced with problems that require solutions. Jake was studying the child with new interest. How much do you know about human technology, Kira? I know that your ship carries weapons capable of reducing a small moon to cosmic dust, but you use them primarily as deterrents. I know that your medical facilities can regrow lost limbs, but your psychological health systems are primitive compared to your physical medicine. I know that your navigation computers are efficient but lack the intuitive algorithms that would allow for truly elegant spacetime manipulation. She paused, then looked directly at Jake with those unsettling golden eyes. I also know that you're attracted to Dr. Chen, but you believe that workplace relationships are inappropriate for command personnel, so you suppress your emotional responses and maintain professional distance despite the fact that she shares your interest. The silence that followed was profound enough that Sarah could hear the ambient hum of the ship's life support systems. Jake's face had gone through several interesting color changes, finally settling on a shade of red that clashed magnificently with his regulation blue uniform. That's very observant, he managed finally. I observe everything, Kira said matter-of-factly. It's how I survived when the hegemony attacked. I watched, I learned, and I hid until your rescue team found me. Sarah found herself torn between professional fascination and personal embarrassment. The child's blunt observations about her relationship with Jake were uncomfortably accurate, but the implications of her survival skills were staggering. "Kira," she said carefully, "how long were you alone in that escape pod?" 17 days, 6 hours, 23 minutes, Kira replied immediately. "I rationed the emergency supplies, rerouted power from non-essential systems to life support, and modified the distress beacon to broadcast on frequencies I calculated would be most likely to attract human attention rather than hegemony patrols." Jake's data pad chimed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, and his expression grew serious. "We're approaching the Terran diplomatic station. The Council wants to meet with you, Kira. They're very interested in hearing about the hegemony attack." "Will they ask me to provide tactical information about hegemony capabilities?" Kira asked. "Probably." The child nodded thoughtfully. "Then, I should prepare appropriate responses. I assume you'll be accompanying me to this meeting, Commander Morrison?" "Yes, I'll be there." Kira turned to Sarah. "Will Dr. Chen be attending as well?" "If her duties permit, yes," Jake said, glancing at Sarah for confirmation. "Good," Tara said with satisfaction. "You work better as a team. Your stress hormones normalize when she's present, and her creative problem-solving improves when she has your tactical perspective to consider." She picked up another piece of medical equipment and began examining it with the same focused attention she'd given the scanner. "Human relationship dynamics are fascinating. You've created complex social structures that somehow balance individual desires with group cohesion. Very different from Zephyrian pair bonding protocols. How do Zephyrians handle relationships?" Sarah asked, partly from professional curiosity and partly from a desperate desire to change the subject away from her own apparently transparent feelings. "Efficiency," Kira said simply. "Compatible individuals are matched based on genetic optimization, psychological complementarity, and resource allocation requirements. Emotional attachment develops through shared experiences and mutual dependency, but the initial pairing is determined by logical analysis." Jake cleared his throat. "That sounds practical." "It is," Kira agreed. "But also limiting. Zephyrian art is beautiful but predictable. Our music follows mathematical principles that ensure harmony but rarely produce the kind of emotional resonance I've observed in human cultural expressions." She held up the device she'd been examining. What had been a simple blood pressure monitor was now displaying readings that seemed to map cardiovascular efficiency in real time, complete with predictive algorithms for potential health issues. "Human irrationality produces inefficiency," Kira continued, "but it also generates innovation that purely logical systems cannot achieve. Your willingness to make decisions based on emotional responses rather than optimal outcomes creates possibilities that my people never consider." "Is that good or bad?" Sarah asked. Kara looked thoughtful. "I believe it's why the hegemony fears humans more than they fear species with superior technology or military strength. You're unpredictable in ways that make strategic planning difficult." Jake's datapad chimed again, this time with an urgency indicator. He read the message, and his expression darkened. "We have a problem. Long-range sensors have detected hegemony ships moving toward Terran space. It looks like a scouting force, but they're heading directly for the diplomatic station." "How long until they arrive?" Sarah asked. 18 hours, maybe 20 at the outside." Kara set down the medical device and turned to face them both, her golden eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed far too old for her apparent age. "Commander Morrison, may I ask you a question?" "Of course." "If you're single," she said with the innocent directness that only children could manage, "would you marry Dr. Chen?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that somehow, in the span of a single conversation, everything about their situation had become infinitely more complicated. The hegemony was coming, they had a refugee child who could apparently rebuild their technology with her bare hands, and now they were dealing with personal revelations that threatened to upend the careful professional balance they'd maintained for months. Jake looked at Sarah, then at Kara, then back at Sarah. His mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged.
That's not really. I mean, there are regulations about. He stammered. Kara watched his response with the analytical attention of a scientist studying an interesting chemical reaction.
Your physiological responses indicate that the answer is affirmative, but your social conditioning prevents direct acknowledgement.
Fascinating.
Sarah felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, and she wasn't sure whether the ground beneath her feet represented safety or just another kind of danger. But, as she looked at Jake's flustered expression and Kara's expectant face, she realized that some questions, once asked, couldn't be unanswered. The hegemony was coming, and somehow she suspected that before this was over, they were all going to discover just how unpredictable humanity could be. The Terran diplomatic station hung in space like a gleaming monument to human ambition, its rotating sections creating artificial gravity while its solar collectors fed power to some of the most advanced communication and defense systems in known space. As their transport shuttle approached the docking bay, Sarah couldn't help but notice how Kara pressed her small face to the viewport, studying the station's architecture with the same intense focus she'd applied to dismantling their medical equipment. Your people build with redundancy, Kara observed, pointing to the multiple backup systems visible on the station's exterior.
Every critical function has at least 3 alternative methods of operation. Inefficient, but highly survivable.
We've learned that elegant solutions tend to have elegant failure modes, Jake replied from the pilot's seat. Sometimes crude but reliable beats sophisticated and fragile.
The docking procedure went smoothly, though Sarah noticed that station security seemed unusually alert.
Armed guards flanked the airlock, and she counted at least 3 scanning devices aimed at their shuttle before they were cleared to disembark. The message was clear: with hegemony forces potentially heading their way, the station wasn't taking any chances. Ambassador Elena Vasquez met them at the airlock, her diplomatic bearing intact despite the obvious stress lines around her eyes. A veteran of first contact protocols with over a dozen species, she had the kind of calm competence that made her invaluable in crisis situations. She also had the distinction of being one of the few humans who'd successfully negotiated territorial agreements with the notoriously aggressive Korthak Empire without starting a war.
"Commander Morrison, Dr. Chen," she said, extending her hand in greeting.
Then, she knelt down to bring herself to Kira's eye level.
"And you must be Kira. I'm very sorry for the loss of your people." Kira studied the ambassador with the same analytical intensity she'd shown everyone else.
Your sympathetic response is genuine, but you're primarily concerned with the strategic implications of my survival. You want to know what intelligence I can provide about hegemony capabilities and intentions.
Ambassador Vasquez blinked, clearly taken aback by the child's blunt assessment. "That's direct."
Zephyrians value honesty in communication, Kira replied.
"Diplomatic euphemisms are inefficient when circumstances require immediate action." "Right," Vasquez said, recovering her composure. "Well, you're correct that we need to understand what we're dealing with. The Security Council is convening in 20 minutes. If you're willing, we'd like you to share what you witnessed during the attack."
As they walked through the station's corridors, Sarah noticed how other personnel stopped to stare at their small group. News of the Zephyrian massacre had apparently spread quickly, and the sight of what appeared to be the only survivor was drawing attention from every direction.
Kira seemed oblivious to the scrutiny, instead focusing on the technical details of the station's construction.
"Your artificial gravity generators are operating at 17% above optimal efficiency," she commented to no one in particular. "Simple modifications to the field harmonics could reduce power consumption by nearly 30%.
Jake glanced at Ambassador Vasquez. "She's been doing this all morning."
"Yesterday she rebuilt our medical scanner into something that can apparently peer into alternate dimensions."
"I've heard about Zephyrian technological intuition," Vasquez said. "But I was under the impression it didn't manifest until adulthood."
"Trauma can accelerate certain developmental processes," Kira said matter-of-factly.
"Survival necessity tends to unlock capabilities that remain dormant under normal circumstances."
They reached the Security Council chambers, where a collection of humanity's best strategic minds had gathered around a holographic display showing the current disposition of forces in local space. Admiral Catherine Ross, the station commander, stood at the head of the table with the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years turning impossible military situations into unlikely victories. "Commander Morrison," she said without preamble, "your timing is excellent. We've just received updated intelligence on the hegemony force heading our way. It's larger than we initially thought." The holographic display shifted to show a three-dimensional tactical map. Red indicators represented hegemony ships, 12 vessels including what appeared to be at least 3 heavy cruisers and a dreadnought-class flagship. Blue indicators showed human defensive positions, which looked pitifully outnumbered by comparison. "Current estimates put their arrival at 14 hours, Admiral Ross continued. "We've scrambled what defensive forces we can, but, frankly, we're looking at a significant tactical disadvantage." Kira had been studying the display with her characteristic intensity. Now she stepped forward, her small stature making her look absurdly young among the assembled military and diplomatic personnel. "Your defensive configuration is flawed," she announced. The room fell silent. Admiral Ross raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? You're positioning your forces to maximize defensive firepower, but you're not accounting for hegemony tactical doctrine," Kira continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was critiquing the strategic planning of some of humanity's most experienced military leaders. "They don't engage in direct confrontations when they can avoid it. They prefer psychological warfare." She walked closer to the holographic display, and Sarah noticed that her movements had taken on a peculiar quality, more assured, more purposeful, as if discussing military strategy was somehow unlocking aspects of her personality that hadn't been visible before. "The attack on our colony ship followed a specific pattern," Kira said. "First, they disabled our communications to prevent distress calls. Then, they targeted non-essential areas to create fear and confusion while avoiding critical systems. Only after our defensive capabilities were degraded through panic and disorganization did they move to complete destruction." Admiral Ross leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" "That this force isn't here to destroy the station," Kira replied. "They're here to capture it. A functioning Terran diplomatic facility would be far more valuable to them than a debris field." General Martinez, the station's chief of security, frowned. "That doesn't match their usual tactics. The hegemony typically prefers overwhelming force. Against species they consider weak," Kira agreed. "But humans have a reputation for being unpredictably dangerous. They want to test that reputation before committing to a full-scale war." She gestured to the tactical display, and Sarah was surprised when the hologram responded to her movements, reshaping itself to show alternative force deployments. Kira must have somehow interfaced with the station's computers during the few minutes they'd been in the room. "If they wanted to destroy this station, they would have brought more ships," Kira continued. "This force is sized for intimidation and capture, not annihilation. They want to see how humans respond under pressure." Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward. "What kind of response do you think they're expecting?" "Surrender or desperate defensive action," Kira said immediately. "They've studied human tactical databases, but their analysis is based on limited information. They expect you to either give up to protect civilian lives or fight desperately and lose." Jake had been studying the display with growing understanding. "But they don't know how humans actually behave when our backs are against the wall." "Precisely," Kira said, turning to face him with something that might have been approval. "Your species has a tendency to become more creative under extreme pressure. The hegemony's strategic models don't account for innovation born from desperation." Admiral Ross crossed her arms. "So what do you suggest we do with this information?" Kira's golden eyes took on an almost predatory gleam. "We give them what they're not expecting." Before anyone could ask what she meant, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lighting bathed the council chambers in red as a communications officer rushed in with a priority message. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the hegemony fleet," the officer reported. "They're demanding immediate surrender of the station and all personnel." "How long until they arrive?" Admiral Ross asked. 6 hours, ma'am. They've increased speed significantly." Kira nodded as if this confirmed something she'd been thinking.
Accelerated timeline indicates urgency on their part. Something has changed their operational parameters. Ambassador Vasquez activated her communicator. Patch the transmission through to the council chambers. A holographic display shifted to show the bridge of a hegemony vessel. The creature that appeared was typical of the hegemony's dominant species, tall, heavily armored, with facial features that suggested both intelligence and predatory instincts. When it spoke, its voice carried the universal translator's rendering of absolute authority. Attention Terran Facility. I am War Commander Thrax of the Hegemony Expansion Fleet. You will surrender this station and all personnel immediately. Any resistance will result in the complete destruction of your facility and the execution of all inhabitants. Admiral Ross stepped forward. This is Admiral Catherine Ross, Commanding Officer of Terran Diplomatic Station Omega. Under what authority do you make these demands?
Under the authority of strength, Thrax replied. Your species has been granted tolerance due to your reputation for irrational violence, but that tolerance has limits. Recent intelligence suggests that human capabilities have been vastly overestimated. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the war commander's tone suggested that this wasn't just standard hegemony aggression. This felt personal. What recent intelligence? Ambassador Vasquez asked. Thrax's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. We have analyzed the tactical responses of human forces during the Meridian System incident. Your vaunted unpredictability appears to be nothing more than poor strategic planning compensated for by superior technology. Jake's hands had clenched into fists. The Meridian System incident had been a disaster, a human colony fleet caught off guard by raiders, resulting in significant casualties. The official reports had cited equipment failures and communication problems, but Sarah knew that Jake had lost friends in that action. Furthermore, Thrax continued, we have recently acquired detailed intelligence about human psychological and tactical limitations from a most reliable source. Kira suddenly went very still beside Sarah, her golden eyes fixed on the holographic display with an intensity that was almost frightening. You have 6 of your time units to comply, Thrax said. Failure to surrender will result in immediate military action. The transmission cut out, leaving the council chambers in tense silence. Admiral Ross began issuing orders to her staff, but Sarah's attention was focused on Kira, whose entire demeanor had changed dramatically. Kira, she said quietly. What's wrong? The child turned to look at her, and Sarah was disturbed to see something like fear in those golden eyes for the first time since they'd found her. Dr. Chen, Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something about my escape from the colony ship. Something I haven't mentioned before. Jake knelt down beside them. What is it? I wasn't the only survivor, Kira said. My teacher, Dr. Zilthak, was with me in the escape pod. But the pod was only equipped for one occupant for the duration of our journey. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Kira, what happened? Dr. Zilthak sacrificed himself so that I would survive, Kira said. But, before he died, the hegemony forces captured him. They interrogated him for 3 days using neural extraction techniques. He would have told them everything he knew about human tactical capabilities, psychological profiles, and strategic weaknesses. Admiral Ross had stopped issuing orders and was now focused entirely on their conversation. What exactly did this teacher know about human capabilities? Everything, Kara said quietly. Dr. Zilthak was our species' leading expert on xenopsychology. He'd spent 20 years studying human behavior patterns, tactical preferences, and cultural responses to stress. The hegemony now has access to detailed psychological profiles of your entire species. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah realized that they weren't just facing a superior military force, they were facing an enemy that now understood human weaknesses better than humans understood them themselves. There's something else, Kira continued. War Commander Thrax mentioned superior technology compensating for poor strategic planning. That assessment is based on Dr. Zilthak's research, but it's fundamentally flawed. How so? Admiral Ross asked.
Kara looked around the room, studying the faces of the assembled military and diplomatic personnel. Because Dr. Zilthak never understood the most important thing about humans.
Your greatest strength isn't your technology or your tactical flexibility or even your willingness to fight against impossible odds. She paused, then looked directly at Jake and Sarah. Your greatest strength is your ability to form irrational emotional bonds that motivate you to exceed your rational limitations.
Ambassador Vasquez frowned. What do you mean?
Dr. Zilthak studied human romantic relationships as a tactical weakness, Kara explained. He believed that emotional attachments made you predictable and exploitable. He never realized that love doesn't make humans weak, it makes them willing to attempt impossible things.
Jake's face had gone pale. The question you asked me earlier was not random curiosity, Kara confirmed. I've been studying your relationship dynamics since you rescued me.
I needed to understand whether humans could form the kind of bonds that would motivate them to sacrifice rational self-interest for irrational emotional goals. Sarah felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet.
You've been testing us?
I've been trying to determine whether humanity possesses the psychological resources necessary to defeat an enemy that knows all your rational capabilities, Kara said. Because the hegemony has prepared for everything except the possibility that you might act from love rather than logic. She looked around the room one more time, then returned her gaze to Jake and Sarah.
So I'll ask again, Commander Morrison. If you're single, would you marry Dr. Chen?
Because your answer might determine whether we have any hope of surviving the next 6 hours. The silence in the Security Council chambers stretched into something almost tangible, broken only by the distant hum of the station's life support systems and the occasional crackle of communication traffic as defensive preparations continued throughout the facility. Every eye in the room was focused on Commander Jake Morrison, who stood frozen with the weight of a question that seemed to carry the fate of everyone aboard the station. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Jake struggle with Kara's seemingly simple query. The child stood between them, her golden eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed far too ancient for her apparent age, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some answers couldn't be rushed. Jake began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Sarah recognized as his tell for extreme stress.
This isn't exactly standard military protocol. Admiral Ross cleared her throat. With respect, Commander, we're well beyond standard protocol at this point.
She looked at Kara with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that they were dealing with something far more complex than a refugee child.
Kara, can you explain what human romantic attachments have to do with our tactical situation? Kara nodded, her attention still focused on Jake and Sarah. Dr. Zilthak's research identified human emotional bonds as a strategic vulnerability.
His models predicted that humans would prioritize the safety of their loved ones over military objectives, making them susceptible to hostage scenarios and emotional manipulation.
She gestured toward the tactical display, which still showed the approaching hegemony fleet. War Commander Thrax's strategy is based on this assessment.
He expects you to surrender the station to protect civilian lives, or to make desperate tactical choices driven by fear for people you care about.
Ambassador Vasquez frowned. That actually sounds like a fairly accurate assessment of human psychology.
It's partially correct, Kara agreed.
Humans do prioritize the safety of those they love.
But Dr. Zilthak's analysis missed a crucial factor. When humans act from love rather than fear, they don't become weaker, they become capable of things that defy rational analysis. She walked over to the tactical display and began manipulating the holographic controls with the same ease she'd shown with their medical equipment. The display shifted to show historical human conflicts, battles where outnumbered forces had achieved impossible victories against superior enemies.
Battle of Thermopylae, she said, highlighting one engagement.
300 Spartans held off an army of thousands because they were fighting for their homeland and families.
Battle of Britain, outnumbered pilots defending their nation against overwhelming odds.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, civilians with improvised weapons standing against one of the most powerful military forces in human history.
The examples continued, each one showing a pattern that Sarah was beginning to recognize.
In every case, humans had faced impossible odds and found ways to win through sheer determination fueled by emotional bonds.
Your species doesn't just fight for survival, Kara continued.
You fight for love, for honor, for ideals that exist only in your emotional landscape. And, when you fight for those things, you become unpredictable in ways that no tactical computer can model. Jake was staring at the display with growing understanding. You're saying the hegemony is expecting us to act rationally?
Precisely, Kara said.
They've prepared for every logical response to their superior force. But, they haven't prepared for the possibility that you might do something completely irrational because you care more about protecting what you love than preserving your own lives.
General Martinez stepped forward. What kind of irrational action are you suggesting? Before Kara could answer, alarms blared again throughout the station.
A communications officer rushed in with another priority message.
Admiral, the hegemony fleet has changed course. They're moving to intercept a civilian transport that just entered the system.
The tactical display updated to show a single, fragile-looking vessel on an intercept course with the station. Sarah felt her stomach clench as she recognized the ship's configuration. It was a refugee transport, probably carrying families fleeing from border conflicts.
How many aboard? Admiral Ross asked grimly. Approximately 800 civilians, ma'am. Mixed species, including human families.
War Commander Thrax's image appeared on the display without warning, his predatory features arranged in what might have been satisfaction. Admiral Ross, I trust you are observing our new tactical situation.
We now hold 800 innocent lives as leverage for your compliance.
You're threatening civilians, Jake said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger.
I am demonstrating the consequences of resistance, Thrax replied.
Surrender your station immediately, or watch as we demonstrate hegemony justice upon those who travel under Terran protection.
The transmission cut out again, leaving the council chambers in tense silence.
Sarah could see the calculation playing out on every face in the room, 800 lives against the strategic importance of the diplomatic station.
It was exactly the kind of choice that Dr. Zilthak's research would have predicted humans couldn't handle. Kara was studying the faces around the room with the same analytical intensity she applied to everything else.
War Commander Thrax expects you to choose between saving the civilians and protecting the station.
He believes this choice will paralyze your decision-making capability. It's a hell of a choice, General Martinez muttered. It's a false choice, Kara said firmly. But only if you're willing to act irrationally. Admiral Ross turned to face the child fully. What do you have in mind? A wedding, Kara said simply.
The silence that followed was so profound that Sarah wondered if the station's life support had failed.
Every person in the room was staring at Kara as if she just suggested they solved their tactical problems by performing interpretive dance.
I'm sorry, Ambassador Vasquez said finally.
Did you just say a wedding?
Commander Morrison and Dr. Chen are going to get married, Kara announced with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. Right now, in front of everyone, as publicly as possible. Jake's mouth opened and closed several times.
What? How is that supposed to help? Because it's the most irrational thing you could possibly do under these circumstances, Kara explained. War Commander Thrax is expecting you to make tactical decisions based on military necessity.
He's not expecting you to pause in the middle of a crisis to celebrate love. Sarah felt as though she were caught in some kind of fever dream.
Kara, I appreciate the sentiment, but this really isn't the time.
It's exactly the time, Kara interrupted. Dr. Zilthak's research focused on how human emotional attachments could be exploited as weaknesses. But he never studied what happens when humans openly embrace those attachments as sources of strength. She manipulated the tactical display again, showing communication patterns throughout the station. Right now, every person on this station is operating from fear. They're afraid of the hegemony, afraid of death, afraid of making the wrong choice.
Fear makes humans predictable.
The display shifted to show psychological profiles, stress levels, decision-making patterns, tactical responses driven by anxiety and desperation. But if Commander Morrison and Dr. Chen get married right now, in the middle of this crisis, you send a completely different message, Kara continued.
You tell everyone that love is more important than fear, that hope is stronger than desperation, that humans can create beauty even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Admiral Ross was staring at the child with the expression of someone watching a minor miracle. That's actually insane.
Exactly, Kara said with satisfaction.
Completely, utterly, beautifully insane.
The kind of insanity that makes humans dangerous to anyone who thinks they can predict your behavior. Jake looked at Sarah, his face cycling through a dozen different emotions.
Sarah, this is crazy.
It's completely crazy, Sarah agreed. But, as she looked around the room at the faces of the people she'd served with, people she'd grown to care about over months of deep space missions, she began to understand what Kara was really suggesting. You're not just talking about a wedding, she said slowly.
You're talking about a psychological weapon. I'm talking about hope, Kara corrected. The most powerful force in the human emotional arsenal.
When humans act from hope rather than fear, they become capable of miracles. She gestured to the tactical display one more time. Right now, the hegemony holds all the cards. They have superior firepower, strategic positioning, and detailed knowledge of human psychological weaknesses.
But they don't have hope.
They don't understand what it means to love something more than you fear losing it.
Ambassador Vasquez was nodding slowly. If we broadcast the ceremony throughout the station, everyone would see it.
The psychological impact could be significant.
More than that, General Martinez added, his tactical mind clearly working through the implications. If we broadcast it to the civilian transport and the hegemony fleet, we'd be sending a message that we're not paralyzed by their threats.
Jake looked at Sarah again, and this time his expression was different, still uncertain, but with something else underneath.
Something that might have been hope.
Sarah, he said quietly, I know this isn't how either of us imagined this moment, but
Kara's right about one thing.
I have been attracted to you for months. I've been too focused on regulations and protocol to do anything about it, but if we're about to die anyway. You're not going to die, Kara said confidently.
You're going to win.
But only if you're willing to do something so irrational that the hegemony can't predict it. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her colleagues, people she'd trusted with her life countless times during their missions together. She saw fear in their eyes, but also determination, and, underneath it all, a spark of something that might have been desperate hope. Jake, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, are you asking me to marry you? He took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the Security Council chambers, in front of the assembled military leadership of the station, with alarms blaring and enemy forces approaching and 800 civilian lives hanging in the balance.
Dr. Sarah Chen, he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, will you marry me?
Sarah looked down at him, then at Kara's expectant face, then at the tactical display showing the approaching hegemony fleet.
It was insane. It was irrational.
It was completely contrary to every principle of crisis management she'd ever learned.
Yes, she said.
The word seemed to echo through the chamber with the force of a battle cry.
Admiral Ross was already reaching for her communicator.
Attention all station personnel, she announced, her voice carrying throughout the facility. Commander Morrison and Dr. Chen will be married in the main assembly hall in 1 hour.
All personnel not currently on essential duty are invited to attend. This ceremony will be broadcast throughout the system.
She paused, then added with the hint of a smile, and may whatever deities watch over fools and lovers help us all. The main assembly hall of Terran Diplomatic Station Omega had been designed to host formal diplomatic receptions and cultural exchanges. Under normal circumstances, it could comfortably accommodate 500 people for elegant social functions. Today, it was packed with nearly 800 station personnel who had somehow managed to attend despite ongoing battle preparations, their dress uniforms hastily thrown over tactical gear, creating a surreal blend of military readiness and celebratory atmosphere. Sarah stood in the makeshift bride's preparation area, which had been Dr. Martinez's office 20 minutes ago, staring at her reflection in a hastily requisitioned mirror. The station's quartermaster had somehow produced a white dress that fit reasonably well, though she suspected it had been intended for formal diplomatic functions rather than weddings. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to get married in borrowed clothes while enemy ships approached their position. Your heart rate is elevated, but not in a pattern consistent with fear, Kira observed from her position on a makeshift chair. The child had appointed herself as unofficial wedding coordinator, displaying an organizational efficiency that would have impressed a seasoned event planner. You're experiencing anticipatory excitement combined with genuine affection.
Physiologically optimal conditions for pair bonding. Thanks for the analysis, Sarah said, adjusting the dress one more time.
I have to say, when I imagined my wedding day, it never involved tactical discussions and enemy fleets. Human imagination tends to focus on ideal scenarios rather than realistic probabilities, Kira replied matter-of-factly. But, adaptability to unexpected circumstances is one of your species' greatest strengths. Through the temporary partition, Sarah could hear the sounds of organized chaos as station personnel transformed the assembly hall into something resembling a wedding venue. Someone had apparently located decorative fabric, and she could hear the distinctive sound of Commander Torres issuing instructions about flower arrangements with the same authoritative tone he typically reserved for weapons deployments. Ambassador Vasquez appeared in the doorway, looking harried but determined. Sarah, we need to discuss the broadcast parameters.
This ceremony is going to be transmitted to everyone in the system, including the hegemony fleet. What's their reaction so far? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Confused, Vasquez admitted.
War Commander Thrax has been trying to establish communication for the last 30 minutes.
He seems genuinely perplexed by our behavior. Kara nodded with satisfaction. Confusion is the first stage of tactical disruption.
When your opponent cannot predict your actions, they cannot effectively counter them.
The civilian transport has been responding more positively, Vasquez continued.
Their captain reports that morale has improved significantly since we announced the wedding. Apparently, several families aboard have decided to hold their own ceremonies while they await rescue.
Sarah blinked. They're holding weddings on a ship that's being threatened by hostile forces? 3 so far, with 2 more planned, Vasquez confirmed.
It seems your ceremony has inspired a wave of romantic optimism throughout the system. Before Sarah could process this information, alarms chimed throughout the station, not the harsh battle alerts they'd been hearing all day, but the melodious tones typically reserved for special announcements. "Attention station personnel," came Admiral Ross's voice over the communication system.
"The ceremony will begin in 10 minutes. All off-duty personnel report to the assembly hall. Essential duty stations will receive full broadcast coverage." Sarah took a deep breath, looking at her reflection one more time. It was insane.
It was completely irrational. It was exactly what Kira had said it would be, an act of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. "Dr. Chen," Kira said, standing up from her chair with the formal bearing of someone about to deliver important information. "There's something I need to tell you before the ceremony begins."
"What is it?"
"My analysis of your relationship with Commander Morrison indicates a probability of successful long-term pair bonding that exceeds 97%. Your psychological compatibility, shared values, and complementary skill sets suggest that you would have found each other eventually, even under normal circumstances." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the adrenaline of their current situation.
"Are you saying this isn't just a tactical decision?"
"I'm saying that sometimes the most rational choice is to trust irrational emotions," Kira replied. "And sometimes the best tactical decisions are the ones that feel right in ways that have nothing to do with strategy." The journey to the assembly hall felt surreal, like walking through a dream where military personnel had transformed into wedding guests and emergency lighting had somehow become romantic ambience. As they approached the main doors, Sarah could hear music. Someone had apparently located the station's ceremonial musicians and convinced them to provide live accompaniment.
The doors opened, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat.
The assembly hall had been completely transformed. Fabric panels in soft blues and whites hung from the ceiling, creating an atmosphere of elegant celebration. Flowers, where had they found flowers on a space station, decorated improvised arches and altar areas. But, most importantly, the hall was filled with faces she recognized, colleagues and friends who had somehow managed to create beauty in the middle of a crisis. Jake stood at the makeshift altar, wearing his dress uniform with an expression that combined nervousness, determination, and something that made Sarah's heart skip. Beside him, Chaplain Williams, the station's interfaith minister, waited with the kind of calm competence that came from years of performing ceremonies under unusual circumstances. As Sarah began walking down the improvised aisle, she noticed the tactical display's position throughout the hall, showing the ongoing military situation.
The hegemony fleet was still approaching, now less than 2 hours away.
The civilian transport remained in their intercept path. But, somehow, none of that seemed to matter as much as the expression on Jake's face when he saw her. "Dearly beloved," Chaplain Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the hall sound system, "we are gathered here today under extraordinary circumstances to witness the union of Commander Jacob Morrison and Dr. Sarah Chen in marriage." The words felt both familiar and strange, ancient ritual performed in the middle of a space-age crisis. But, as Sarah looked around the hall at the faces of her friends and colleagues, she realized that Kara had been right. This wasn't just about tactics or psychology. This was about hope, about the human refusal to let fear determine their choices.
Marriage, Chaplain Williams continued, is an act of faith.
Faith in the future, faith in love's ability to overcome obstacles, and faith in the power of two people to create something greater than the sum of their individual parts.
On the tactical displays, Sarah could see that the hegemony fleet had slowed their approach.
War Commander Thrax was probably trying to understand what kind of tactical maneuver this represented, running it through every strategic analysis model at his disposal.
"Commander Morrison," Chaplain Williams said, "do you take Dr. Chen to be your wife, in whatever circumstances the future may bring?"
Jake's voice was steady and clear.
"I do." "Dr. Chen, do you take Commander Morrison to be your husband, through whatever challenges may come?"
Sarah looked into Jake's eyes and saw not just the man she'd worked beside for months, but the person who had chosen to kneel in front of military leadership and ask her to marry him while enemy forces approached their position.
"I do."
As they exchanged rings, simple bands hastily fabricated by the station's machine shop, Sarah noticed something changing on the tactical displays.
The civilian transport was altering course, moving away from the intercept path with the hegemony fleet.
More importantly, several of the hegemony ships were hesitating, their formation becoming less coordinated. "By the power vested in me by the Terran Diplomatic Corps," Chaplain Williams announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that followed was gentle, sweet, and witnessed by 800 people and broadcast throughout the star system. But it was also something more, a declaration of faith in the future, an act of defiance against despair, and a demonstration of the kind of irrational hope that Kara had insisted would make them dangerous to their enemies. The applause that erupted in the assembly hall was thunderous, but it was interrupted by an urgent communication alert. Admiral Ross's voice came over the speakers, her tone mixing surprise with cautious optimism.
"All personnel, be advised that we are receiving communication requests from multiple hegemony vessels.
War Commander Thrax is demanding to speak with Station Command immediately." Jake and Sarah were still standing at the altar, officially married for all of 30 seconds, when Thrax's image appeared on the main display.
His predatory features were arranged in an expression of complete bewilderment.
"Admiral Ross," he said, his voice carrying none of the confident authority it had held during previous communications.
"Explain the meaning of this ceremony."
Admiral Ross stepped forward, her bearing every inch the military commander despite the wedding decorations surrounding her. "War Commander, we have just witnessed the marriage of two of our finest officers."
"Is there something unclear about human matrimonial customs?" "You are under military threat," Thrax said, his confusion evident even through the universal translator. "Your defensive situation is desperate. Why are you celebrating?" Jake stepped forward, Sarah's hand still in his. "Because we choose to create joy even in the face of fear. Because love is stronger than the threat of death. Because hope is the most powerful weapon humanity possesses." Thrax's expression shifted through several emotions that the translator couldn't adequately render. "This is tactically incomprehensible. Dr. Zilthak's research indicated that humans under extreme stress become predictable through emotional compromise." "Dr. Zilthak never understood," Kara said, stepping into view of the camera. "He studied human love as a weakness because Zephyrians form pair bonds through logical analysis. But human love isn't logical. It's transformative. She gestured toward the crowded assembly hall. Look around, War Commander. Does this look like a species that has been weakened by emotional attachment? Or does it look like a species that has chosen to grow stronger through connection with each other? On the tactical display, Sarah could see that more hegemony ships were breaking formation. Some were actually pulling back, their commanders apparently as confused as Thrax by the humans' inexplicable behavior.
Furthermore, Kira continued, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate through the communication channel, you should know that this ceremony has been broadcast throughout the system. The civilian families aboard the transport have been inspired by this display of hope. Several have chosen to hold their own marriage ceremonies rather than surrender to despair.
Thrax's confusion was giving way to something that might have been concern. What is the tactical significance of multiple simultaneous pair bonding ceremonies?
The tactical significance, Admiral Ross said with the hint of a smile, is that you're no longer facing a collection of frightened individuals making desperate choices.
You're facing families. You're facing people who have just publicly declared their commitment to protecting what they love more than they fear losing their lives. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across space itself. On the tactical display, Sarah could see that the hegemony fleet had stopped their advance entirely. Several ships were actually reversing course.
War Commander Thrax, Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just made the most important commitment of his life in front of 800 witnesses, you came here expecting to find weakness.
But, you've discovered something else instead. What? Thrax asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. You've discovered why the galaxy fears to make humans truly angry, Sarah said, surprised by the confidence in her own voice.
Because when we fight for love instead of just survival, we become capable of impossible things. War Commander Thrax stared out from the main display with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just shifted beneath his feet. Behind him, the bridge of his flagship showed clear signs of confusion among his crew. Officers huddled over tactical displays, gesturing animatedly as they tried to process information that didn't fit any of their established strategic models. You broadcast marriage ceremonies as a psychological weapon, Thrax said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect.
This is unprecedented.
We didn't broadcast ceremonies as weapons, Sarah said, still standing beside Jake at the makeshift altar.
We broadcast hope because that's who we are. The fact that it affects your strategic calculations is secondary.
Kira stepped closer to the communication pickup, her golden eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to age her far beyond her apparent years.
War Commander, may I ask you a question about hegemony pair bonding protocols? Thrax's attention shifted to the child, his predatory features arranging themselves into something approximating curiosity. You may ask. Do hegemony warriors form emotional attachments to their mates that would cause them to fight more fiercely in defense of their families?
The question hung in the air like a challenge.
Thrax was silent for a long moment, his expression cycling through what appeared to be complex calculations.
Hegemony warriors do not form such attachments, he said finally.
Emotional bonds are considered tactical liabilities. Mates are selected for genetic compatibility and resource optimization. Personal preference is irrelevant.
Then, you've never experienced what humans call love, Jake observed. You've never felt the kind of connection that makes you willing to attempt impossible things because failing means losing something more precious than your own life.
Admiral Ross stepped forward, her tactical mind clearly working through the implications of this psychological intelligence.
War Commander, I'm beginning to understand why the hegemony has been expanding so aggressively through this sector.
You're not just conquering territory, you're trying to eliminate something that threatens your entire social structure. Thrax's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been vulnerability beneath his warrior facade. The hegemony maintains order through logical hierarchy and rational resource allocation. Emotional chaos leads to inefficiency and systemic collapse.
Or, Kira said gently, emotional connections lead to the kind of strength that your logical systems can't account for. On the tactical display, Sarah could see that the hegemony fleet was still holding position, but their formation had become increasingly disorganized.
Several ships were actually moving away from the diplomatic station, their commanders apparently unwilling to engage targets whose behavior they couldn't predict. Your Dr. Zilthak was correct about one thing, Admiral Ross continued. Human emotional attachments do make us predictable in some ways. We will fight desperately to protect the people we love. We will take irrational risks to save those who matter to us. We will choose hope over despair even when logic suggests that hope is futile. She gestured toward the crowded assembly hall, where station personnel were still celebrating the wedding despite the ongoing military crisis. But Dr. Zilthak failed to understand that these same emotional attachments also make us capable of miracles. Thrax was studying the images from the assembly hall with the intensity of someone trying to decode an alien language. Your personnel are celebrating while under direct military threat. This behavior defies rational analysis. That's exactly the point, Sarah said. We're not governed entirely by rational analysis. We're capable of choosing joy in the face of terror, of creating beauty in the middle of chaos, of loving each other especially when everything else is falling apart. Alarms chimed throughout the station, but these were different tones, not the harsh alerts of military crisis, but the musical notifications typically reserved for ceremonial occasions. Ambassador Vasquez's voice came over the communication system. All personnel, be advised that we are receiving similar ceremonial transmissions from throughout the system. The civilian transport reports that 12 additional marriage ceremonies have been performed in the last hour. The cargo vessel Prosperity is requesting permission to broadcast their crew's renewal of partnership vows. The research ship Endeavour reports that their chief engineer has just proposed to their xenobiologist, and they're planning a ceremony for this evening. The silence that followed was profound. On the tactical display, Sarah could see that ships throughout the system were changing their status indicators not to combat readiness, but to civilian celebration protocols. Somehow, in the middle of a military crisis, the entire system was choosing to celebrate love instead of surrendering to fear. This is... Thrax began, then stopped, apparently lacking words for what he was witnessing. This is humanity, Jake said simply. We don't just survive crises, we find ways to grow stronger because of them. We don't just endure hardship, we discover beauty in the midst of suffering. We don't just fight against our enemies, we fight for the people we love, and that makes us dangerous in ways you can't calculate. Kira had been studying the hegemony commander with her characteristic analytical intensity. Now she tilted her head in the gesture Sarah had come to recognize as her preparation for delivering particularly important insights. War Commander, she said, may I share an observation about your current tactical situation? Proceed. Your fleet has superior firepower and numerical advantage. Under normal circumstances, you should be able to destroy this station and the civilian vessels with minimal difficulty. But you've stopped your advance because you can no longer predict human behavior patterns. Thrax's silence confirmed her assessment. You came here expecting to exploit human emotional weaknesses, Kira continued. Instead, you've discovered that human emotions can be sources of incomprehensible strength. Your strategic models have no framework for analyzing opponents who become more dangerous when they have something to protect. She paused, studying his reaction before continuing. But there's something else you should consider. Your own crew is observing these marriage ceremonies. They're seeing humans choose joy over fear, hope over despair, love over survival. How long before your own warriors begin to question why hegemony culture forbids the kind of emotional connections that clearly make humans so formidable? The effect of her words was immediately visible on Thrax's bridge. Several of his officers were indeed studying the ceremony broadcasts, their expressions reflecting something that might have been longing. The rigid discipline of the hegemony command structure seemed to waver as crew members exchanged glances that suggested forbidden thoughts. You're suggesting that human emotional patterns could contaminate hegemony personnel, Thrax said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm suggesting that your people might discover what they've been missing, Sarah said. The question is, are you prepared to destroy something beautiful because you're afraid of what it might teach you? The communication channel remained open, but Thrax didn't respond immediately. Instead, he appeared to be listening to reports from his bridge crew, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the tactical situation continued to deteriorate.
Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been defeat.
Admiral Ross, the hegemony fleet will withdraw from this system. May I ask why?
Admiral Ross said, though her tone suggested she had suspicions. Because, Thrax said slowly, my tactical analysis indicates that engaging your forces would result in unacceptable losses, not due to your military capabilities, but due to your willingness to sacrifice everything for irrational emotional goals. Warriors who fight for love are unpredictable in ways that make strategic planning impossible. He paused, glancing at something off-screen before returning his attention to the communication pickup. Furthermore, extended exposure to human emotional displays is beginning to affect crew morale in ways that could compromise hegemony's social cohesion.
Admiral Ross nodded gravely. War Commander, for what it's worth, I believe you're making the right choice.
Perhaps, Thrax said. But, I suspect this encounter will have consequences far beyond this system.
The Hegemony High Command will need to reconsider their assessment of human capabilities. The transmission ended, leaving the assembly hall in sudden silence.
On the tactical display, they watched as the Hegemony fleet began an orderly withdrawal, their ships forming up for departure with none of the aggressive posturing they'd shown upon arrival.
They're really leaving, someone whispered from the crowd. Because we got married, Jake said, shaking his head in amazement.
We defeated a superior military force by having a wedding.
You defeated them by demonstrating something they couldn't understand or counter, Kira corrected. You showed them that love makes humans stronger, not weaker.
That emotional connections create capabilities that purely logical systems can't replicate.
Admiral Ross activated her communicator. All vessels in system, this is Diplomatic Station Omega. The hegemony threat has withdrawn. Resume normal operations.
The cheering that erupted in the assembly hall was deafening, but Sarah barely heard it. She was looking at Jake, her new husband, whose expression reflected the same amazement she felt. They'd gotten married in the middle of a military crisis, broadcast it to an enemy fleet, and somehow turned a wedding ceremony into the most effective psychological warfare operation in recent history.
So, Jake said, pulling her closer, what do you think? Best wedding ever, or completely insane? Why not both?
Sarah replied, then kissed him again while 800 people cheered and tactical displays showed enemy ships retreating throughout the system. Kira watched their embrace with the satisfied expression of someone whose complex calculations had produced exactly the desired results. Then, she walked over to the nearest communication station and began composing a message.
What are you doing now? Ambassador Vasquez asked.
Sending a transmission to all surviving Zephyrian colonies, Kara replied. They need to know that humans are even more remarkable than Dr. Zilthak realized. And they need to understand that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that create beauty instead of destruction. She paused in her typing, looking around the hall at the celebrating humans with something that might have been wonder in her golden eyes. Also, she added with the hint of a smile, I'm including detailed specifications for the medical equipment improvements I've been developing. If we're going to be allies with humanity, we should probably contribute something useful to the relationship. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah realized that Kara had been right about everything. The most powerful force in the human arsenal wasn't their technology or their tactical flexibility or even their willingness to fight against impossible odds. It was their capacity to love something more than they feared losing it. It was their ability to choose hope over despair, beauty over destruction, connection over isolation. It was the strength that came from impossible things, like finding love in the middle of a war, like choosing to get married while enemy fleets approached, like discovering that sometimes the most rational response to an irrational universe was to embrace irrationality with both hands and trust that love would show them the way forward. And, as Jake spun her around the makeshift dance floor while enemy ships retreated and friends cheered and a small alien child computed the quantum mechanics of hope, Sarah understood that they had just proven something important about humanity, something that would echo throughout the galaxy for generations to come. When humans fight for love, they become capable of miracles.
Even the impossible ones.